Imagine walking into a marble palace lit by thousands of oil lamps. Perfumed air drifts through golden halls, mosaics shimmer under your feet, and the sound of laughter, music, and clinking goblets echoes all around. A feast is about to begin. But this isn't just any feast. It's a party thrown by a Roman emperor. These weren't quiet dinners. They were spectacles of power, wealth, and decadence. Exotic animals roasted whole, wine flowing like rivers, performers dazzling guests with music and acrobatics. At times, these parties turned dark, full of political plots, assassinations, and fear. In this series, we'll explore why Roman emperors threw the wildest parties in history. From Caligula's floating banquet barges to Nero's endless nights of excess, from foods you'd never imagine eating to entertainments you'd never want to witness, we'll uncover the shocking truth about feasts that defined an empire. So pour yourself a cup of wine or maybe just some water, and let's step inside the banquet hall of Rome. Before the emperors staged their infamous spectacles of excess, Rome's relationship with feasting was rooted in simplicity. In the earliest days of the Republic, when Rome was still a modest city on the banks of the Tiber, meals were practical, often austere affairs. Soldiers, farmers, and statesmen alike dined on modest staples: coarse bread, porridges made from spelt grain, lentils stewed with onions, or cabbages boiled until tender. Goat's milk and watered wine were common, meat far less so. But even these plain meals carried weight. To break bread together was not simply to eat, it was to participate in a civic bond. The earliest Roman feasts were tied to ritual offerings to the gods, festivals marking sowing and harvest, or funeral banquets honoring ancestors. These gatherings were less about indulgence and more about reinforcing the fabric of Roman identity, discipline, community, and reverence for tradition. As Rome expanded beyond its borders, however, its tables began to change. With conquest came contact. Greek colonies in the south introduced more refined cooking techniques, spices arrived from the east, and Etruscans contributed wine culture and an appreciation for elaborate dining vessels. Suddenly, Roman banquets were not just meals, but opportunities to display new flavors and foreign luxuries. A senator might present Greek honey cakes at a feast, or offer imported olives to impress his peers. By the late Republic, the banquet had become a political tool. Wealthy men like Lucullus or Crassus held elaborate feasts, not merely to eat, but to display. Guests were treated to multiple courses: fish, roasted meats, fruits, and sweetened wines, and the host's generosity was meant to win loyalty. In a city where political power was fragile and alliances shifted constantly, a well-timed feast could sway votes more effectively than a speech in the Senate. Writers of the time began to take note of this transformation. Cato the Elder lamented the creeping Greek influence, warning that Rome's sturdy virtues were being eroded by luxuries at the table. Cicero, too, commented on the growing theatricality of dining, where the meal itself became secondary to the spectacle of service, the rarity of ingredients, or the cleverness of the host. Food has become a language of ambition. Still, these gatherings retained a ritual core. They were stages not yet for imperial grandeur, but for patronage. To invite a client to dine was to bind him to loyalty. To seat allies at one's table was to forge a coalition. Even in its earliest forms, the Roman banquet was never just about satisfying hunger, it was about weaving together the strands of politics, culture, and society. It was in these centuries that the foundations for imperial excess were laid. The couches were arranged around a low table, the pouring of wine diluted with water, the order of courses. All of these practices would persist into the empire. But in the Republic, the tone was still comparatively restrained. A man was judged not only by the scale of his feast, but by whether he maintained an air of dignity and control. Excess could attract admiration, but it could also invite criticism. By the time the first emperors seized power, the banquet was already deeply ingrained in Roman political life. What began as ritual offerings and communal meals had transformed into calculated performances. Yet, it would be under the emperors that these meals broke free of restraint entirely. No longer bound by fear of censure from peers, the Caesars turned the banquet into a canvas for extravagance, an art form of indulgence, spectacle, and absolute authority. The origins of Roman feasting remind us that extravagance did not appear overnight. It grew from humble beginnings, layer by layer, as Rome shifted from a city of citizen farmers to a sprawling empire. What started as simple meals of grain and vegetables would, within centuries, evolve into spectacles that stunned the world. To understand the wildest parties of the emperors, we must first see how Rome learned to feast. In the earliest days of Roman dining, feasts were sacred acts. To the earliest Romans, dining together was inseparable from religion. At festivals like Saturnalia, or after triumphs celebrating victory in war, meals were offerings as much as sustenance shared, not just among people, but with the gods themselves. Tables were adorned with laurel wreaths, smoke from sacrifices curled skyward, and priests presided over the distribution of roasted meat. To eat was to participate in a divine order. Every stage of the meal carried symbolic weight. The pouring of the first cup of wine was a libation to Jupiter. The breaking of bread could be a nod to household spirits, the lares and penates. In a society where the boundary between sacred and everyday was thin, feasting was a way to bind mortals and immortals together. Even private banquets were prefaced with small offerings, a pinch of salt, a slice of fruit, a whispered prayer. As Rome grew more powerful, these ritual banquets expanded in scope. Victorious generals returning from campaigns often staged enormous public feasts to honor the gods and to thank the people. Thousands might gather in the forum to share roasted oxen or receive grain distributions. These were not intimate dinners, but mass spectacles of gratitude, where religion, politics, and community converged. A meal could sanctify a triumph, consecrate a treaty, or mark the founding of a temple. By the time emperors emerged, the line between sacred offering and political showmanship blurred. Augustus, the first true emperor, was careful to cloak his banquets in religious imagery. He restored ancient rituals, emphasized moderation, and presented himself as both a pious servant of the gods and generous father to the people. To recline at his table was to be reminded that the emperor himself dined under divine favor. Later rulers, however, twisted this symbolism to their own ends. Caligula surrounded himself with imagery of divinity during feasts, seating himself like a god among mortals. Nero, notorious for extravagance, sometimes reenacted religious festivals at his banquets, with dances, music, and mock sacrifices woven into the meal. What had once been solemn rituals became theatrical parodies, meant to dazzle and dominate rather than to honor the divine. The transition from ritual to spectacle reflected Rome's changing priorities. In its early days, restraint was praised, simplicity honored. A leader who offered plain but plentiful food was admired for his humility and virtue. But as emperors sought to cement their rule, excess itself became a symbol of power. The gods no longer needed appeasing, the people did. To stage a banquet was to prove that Rome's ruler commanded such abundance that even divine generosity seemed pale in comparison. Sacred feasting traditions also influenced the structure of imperial banquets. Reclining on couches, the order of toasts, the mixing of wine with water, all had roots in ancient ritual practices. Even the progression of courses from starters to main dishes to desserts echoed older ceremonies of offering. The emperor's table, for all its glitter, was built on foundations of religious tradition. Yet the irony was plain. The rituals meant to maintain balance between Rome and its gods had, by the imperial age, become vehicles for imbalance. Feasts that once united city and deity now separated ruler from ruled. Where once the community shared sacrifices, now a narrow circle of elites indulged in extravagance. The sacred had become political theatre, and so, by the time Rome's most infamous emperors reigned, the feast was already primed for excess. What began as ritual acts of devotion had transformed into spectacles of control, stage-managed by rulers who saw themselves less as servants of the gods and more as gods themselves. The banquet hall, draped in silks and perfumed with incense, was both temple and throne room, a place where sacred tradition was twisted into imperial propaganda. The journey from sacred ritual to imperial banquet shows us how Rome's feasts evolved, not just in scale but in meaning. They were no longer humble offerings shared between mortals and gods, but living symbols of the emperor's supremacy. What had once been holy became political, and what was once modest became outrageous. Every empire tells stories about itself. Some carve victories into marble, some compose hymns, and others mint coins. Rome, however, told its story through food. To sit at the emperor's table was to taste propaganda, bite by bite. The dishes, the setting, the sheer abundance, all were carefully curated messages about the greatness of the ruler and the empire he commanded. In the imperial imagination, the banquet was more than indulgence. It was proof of Rome's reach. When a platter of oysters from Britain appeared beside figs from Africa and spices from India, it told guests that no land was beyond Rome's grasp. A stuffed dormouse, roasted with herbs and honey, was not merely a delicacy but a symbol. Even the smallest creatures of the empire could be transformed into luxuries at Caesar's command. To taste these foods was to taste conquest itself. Emperors understood this deeply. Augustus, though cautious, used banquets to reinforce his image as a restorer of order. He offered meals that were generous but not wildly extravagant, projecting moderation and stability after the chaos of civil wars. In contrast, Claudius leaned into abundance, flooding his tables with fish from newly conquered provinces to remind guests of military victories. Each dish was an edible proclamation, each course a reminder of Rome's power. Nero, ever the dramatist, turned food into theatre. He staged banquets where courses arrived in rhythm with music, or where entire rooms rotated to reveal new dishes as the evening progressed. Honey-glazed hams and mullet fish, dyed in vivid sauces, dazzled guests not just with flavour but with spectacle. These meals proclaimed Rome's ruler was not merely a man but a master of worlds, bending nature itself to his pleasure. Even the seating carried meaning. To recline close to the emperor was to be honoured, while to be placed at the far end of the couches signalled diminished favour. Guests read every arrangement carefully, knowing that proximity to a platter of rare fruits or the emperor's own goblet might reflect proximity to influence. The table became a silent map of power, as carefully drawn as any decree. The propaganda of food extended beyond the palace. Reports of imperial banquets spread through gossip and literature, magnified by writers eager to criticize or glorify rulers. A story about Caligula feasting on pearls dissolved in vinegar, whether true or not, reinforced the image of his extravagance and divine pretensions. Tales of Domitian's sinister black banquet, where guests dined in funereal gloom, circulated as evidence of his cruelty. Through rumour and narrative, the emperor's table reached far beyond its guests, shaping how the people of Rome and posterity saw their rulers. Importantly, these feasts were not only for elites. Public banquets, though less lavish, allowed emperors to project generosity to the masses. A distribution of grain, a feast of roasted oxen in the forum, or a day where wine flowed freely, was a political act. By feeding the people, emperors bound them in loyalty. By starving them, or appearing stingy, they risked unrest. In Rome, a feast could be as potent as a legion of soldiers. Critics were not blind to the manipulation. Philosophers like Seneca and moralists like Juvenal denounced imperial banquets as shallow displays, distractions meant to dazzle citizens while masking corruption. They pointed to the contrast between elites feasting on honey-roasted game, while ordinary Romans scraped by on porridge. Yet, even their criticisms reinforced the central truth. The feast was propaganda, because everyone understood it carried meaning. In this way, imperial dining was not frivolous. It was a calculated act of governance, a ritual as deliberate as a Senate meeting or military triumph. To feed was to rule, to host was to dominate. A banquet was Rome's empire reduced to a single table, its reach, its wealth, and its fragility laid bare in every course. When we imagine the emperor's table, we often picture excess. But more than gluttony, it was strategy. Every fig, every goblet, every perfumed dish whispered a message. Rome is eternal, the emperor is supreme, and you, the guest, are bound to him by what you have just consumed. If there was one thing that defined an imperial banquet, it was the pursuit of the unusual. Ordinary food had no place at the emperor's table. What impressed the elite was not abundance alone, but strangeness, the ability to present dishes so rare, so improbable, that they astonished as much as they nourished. To dine with Caesar was to enter a world where nature itself seemed bent and twisted for entertainment. Romans scoured the empire for ingredients. Fishermen dredged the seas for delicacies like sea urchins, prized for their briny sweetness, and lamprey eels, considered dangerous but delectable when prepared correctly. Farmers bred snails in jars of milk and wine to fatten them into plump morsels. Dormice, stuffed with minced pork, pine nuts, and herbs, appeared as dainty appetizers, served sizzling on small silver trays. For dessert, chefs offered honey-soaked dates, sesame cakes, and candied rose petals, transforming humble ingredients into confections fit for gods. Presentation mattered as much as rarity. Chefs dyed sauces with wine and spices to produce startling colors, deep crimson, shimmering gold, even purple, the hue of emperors. Entire animals might arrive at the table intact, only to be carved theatrically by servants into intricate portions. One record describes a whole roasted boar bursting open to reveal live birds flying out, a spectacle that blurred the line between cuisine and theatre. Nero, never subtle, was said to delight in culinary pranks. He once ordered jellyfish and mushrooms arranged to mimic celestial constellations, as if guests were feasting on the heavens themselves. Elagabalus, equally infamous, demanded banquets where every dish followed a single theme, meals composed entirely of beans, or entirely of poultry, or even entirely of dishes dyed a single colour. Such extremes pushed feasting beyond dining into the realm of absurd art. Drinks, too, reached unusual heights. While Falernian wine, Rome's most coveted vintage, often flowed, emperors sometimes flavoured wines with rosewater, myrrh, or even ground pearls dissolved in vinegar. Caligula, in one notorious tale, supposedly forced guests to drink goblets of such concoctions to demonstrate that his wealth could turn even precious jewels into beverages. True or not, the story captured the spirit of extravagance that defined the imperial table. Behind the spectacle, armies of cooks and servants laboured to make the impossible appear effortless. Roman culinary handbooks, such as those attributed to Apicius, reveal recipes that combine daring with precision dishes, thickened with fish sauce, spiced with pepper imported from India, or sweetened with honey harvested from distant provinces. To serve such creations was to prove that Rome's networks of trade, conquest, and ingenuity reached every corner of the known world. But the extremes could turn grotesque. Accounts tell of emperors serving dishes so rich and overwhelming that guests fell ill at the table. Elagabalus was rumoured to bury banquets beneath heaps of flowers, suffocating guests in an avalanche of petals. Whether exaggerated or true, such tales reveal how the pursuit of novelty sometimes tipped into cruelty, turning dining into a test of endurance. For the average Roman, these excesses were both fascinating and alien. The The contrast between their simple fare barley porridge, olives, and coarse bread and the emperor's surreal delicacies was immense. The wildness of imperial feasts circulated through gossip, satire, and whispered accounts, cementing the idea that emperors lived in a different universe altogether. Exotic dishes and culinary extremes were not just about indulgence. They were about creating a world where the emperor stood at the center of abundance and absurdity. Each course reminded guests that they were no longer in ordinary Rome, but in a realm shaped by imperial whim. To taste those dishes was to cross into a space where extravagance was the law, and where appetite itself bent to the will of the ruler. Food may have filled the table, but it was entertainment that filled the night. A Roman banquet was never silent. From the moment guests reclined, the air quivered with music lyres plucked in delicate rhythms, flutes sighing over steady drumbeats, and singers weaving stories of gods and heroes into melody. The hall itself became a stage, each corner alive with movement, sound, and spectacle designed to banish boredom and remind guests of the emperor's reach. Acrobats balanced on ivory stools, contorting their bodies into impossible shapes, while golden bracelets glinted in the torchlight. Trained animals performed tricks. Leopards leapt through hoops, elephants knelt to the emperor, and parrots croaked rehearsed greetings. For the jaded elite, novelty was essential. Fire-eaters, jesters, and magicians competed for attention, knowing that their craft could mean fortune or exile depending on the emperor's mood. Gladiatorial displays were sometimes woven into these dinners. Not the bloody, full-scale combats of the Colosseum, but miniature versions staged in the dining hall. Dwarves and women, exotic fighters from distant provinces, or costumed performers would spar for the amusement of reclining nobles. In some cases, condemned criminals were forced into mock battles, turning the emperor's table into a miniature arena where life and death unfolded between courses. Dancers were another constant presence. Some performed the stately steps of traditional Roman dance, while others enacted mythological tales in elaborate pantomime. One might see the tragedy of Orpheus played out in shadows and silk, or the love of Venus and Mars interpreted through movement and music. At other times, dancers from the East brought foreign styles sensual, fluid, hypnotic, that shocked conservative Romans even as they enthralled them. Light itself became part of the entertainment. Banquet halls glowed with oil lamps and torches, their flames reflecting off polished silver and crystal. Some emperors experimented with clever tricks, panels painted with stars to mimic the night sky, ceilings that showered flower petals or perfume on the diners below. Nero was said to have enjoyed dining in revolving rooms, where changing scenery transformed a feast into a journey through landscapes of illusion. But entertainment at the banquet was more than distraction. It was a way to display command over people, animals, and even the environment. A magician producing doves from nowhere, a flute player coaxing music from reeds, or a juggler keeping torches aloft, all reminded guests that the emperor presided over a world where wonder was commonplace. The performances reassured guests that Rome itself was inexhaustible in its variety and vitality. These spectacles also reflected the emperor's personality. Augustus preferred traditional, restrained performances, moral tales, and respectful songs that underscored his image as restorer of Roman virtue. In contrast, Caligula leaned towards shock and transgression, reportedly forcing dignitaries to watch scandalous dances or humiliating performances. Elagabalus staged shows that blurred entertainment with cruelty, mocking his guests with grotesque parodies. The line between art and insult often depended entirely on the emperor's whim. To the guests, entertainment could be a double-edged sword. Delight was expected, but excessive laughter or indifference could be dangerous. A senator who laughed too loudly at a jest risked appearing sycophantic. One who failed to applaud a performance risked insulting the host. In the charged atmosphere of an imperial feast, every reaction carried weight. Ultimately, entertainment at Roman banquets was about weaving illusion into indulgence. Guests left not only with full stomachs, but with memories of music, movement, and marvels that lingered long after the feast ended. The emperor's hall was not simply a place to eat, it was a theatre where every sound and spectacle reinforced the sense that Rome's ruler presided over a world of endless wonder. If food displayed the empire's wealth, wine revealed its spirit. To the Romans, drinking was never a simple act of thirst. It was ritual, performance, and philosophy poured into the same cup. At imperial banquets, wine became the liquid centerpiece, an endless tide of vintage that carried laughter, debate, and danger alike. The Romans prided themselves on their vineyards. Falernian, a strong and fiery wine aged for decades, was the crown jewel of elite banquets. Caligula, once the favorite of the Republic's aristocrats, was so rare in the imperial era that a single amphora could impress more than 100 exotic dishes. Augustus himself preferred Setian wine, a nod to his hometown of Setia, and serving it at court subtly reinforced his personal brand of moderation and tradition. But wine was never drunk pure. To Romans, gulping undiluted wine was considered barbaric. Instead, servers mixed it with water in great bowls, flavoring it with honey, spices, or herbs. Cups were refilled according to rank. Honored guests drank stronger blends, while lesser attendees received weaker pours. Even the way wine was diluted could serve as a quiet reminder of hierarchy. Drinking games were common, borrowed from the Greek symposium. Dice might determine how many cups a guest had to finish, or songs would be passed around the table, each singer obliged to drink before their turn. In some cases, libations, small sips poured to the gods, preceded each round, reminding guests that even drunkenness carried a trace of sacred duty. The laughter, the dares, the half-sung verses, these were as essential to the evening as the dishes themselves. Yet wine also carried risks. Too much could loosen tongues, spilling secrets in an atmosphere where whispers could kill. Stories circulated of senators who revealed conspiracies after too many cups, or of courtiers who mocked the emperor while drunk, only to pay for it in blood the next morning. In Rome, a goblet could be as dangerous as a dagger. Emperors set the tone. Augustus, cautious, preferred moderation, sipping lightly and encouraging restraint. Nero, however, revelled in intoxication, sometimes hosting all-night revels where wine was served by the barrel and torches, burned until dawn. Elagabalus was said to drink wines mixed with snow, transported from distant mountains simply to cool his cups. The choice of vintage and the manner of drinking always reflected imperial identity. The vessels themselves were symbols of extravagance. Crystal goblets, silver cups, even cups carved from amber or onyx turned each sip into a display of wealth. Some emperors competed in ostentation. Caligula famously ordered chalices studded with jewels, while others dissolved pearls into their drinks, claiming to outdo nature itself. Whether exaggerated or not, these tales reinforce the idea that no indulgence was too extreme for the imperial table. For ordinary Romans, wine was part of daily life, though never in such rarefied forms. They drank rougher vintages, often watered down or soured, sometimes thickened into vinegar-like posca. To hear of emperors drinking pearls or honeyed Falernian must have seemed surreal, proof of a gulf between ruler and ruled as wide as the empire itself. Wine at imperial banquets was not simply about taste, it was about mood. A gathering might start with polite toasts and end in wild abandon, depending on how freely the cups were refilled. The constant flow of wine blurred lines between politics and pleasure, friendship and rivalry, merriment and menace. By dawn, alliances could be forged, broken, or betrayed under its influence. In Rome, wine was more than drink. It was liquid, politics, philosophy, and spectacle combined. Every sip reminded guests of their place in the hierarchy. Every toast reaffirmed loyalty, and every spill of laughter or anger echoed with consequence. In the glow of the banquet hall, as cups were raised and amphorae drained, wine became both the lifeblood of celebration and the fuel of danger. If the food was astonished and the wine intoxicated, it was often the more private entertainments that truly shocked. Roman banquets, particularly under the most notorious emperors, blurred the line between feast and debauchery. The dining hall, thick with incense and lamplight, could transform by midnight into something far more carnal. Courtesans and companions were part of the spectacle. Skilled in music, poetry, and seduction, they drifted among the couches, offering not only conversation but intimacy. Perfumed hair brushed against shoulders, garlands slipped down necks, and whispers carried through the torchlight. For many guests, these women and sometimes men were as central to the evening as the roasted boar or the honey cakes. Their presence affirmed the emperor's ability to provide pleasures beyond imagination. Some emperors made their own desires the centerpiece of the evening. Caligula, infamous for erasing boundaries, was said to flaunt lovers openly, even plucking wives or daughters of senators from the couches to humiliate their families. Nero arranged banquets that spilled into adjoining gardens where alcoves draped with silks hid beds and couches, creating spaces for whispered encounters or public liaisons. In these moments, the banquet ceased to be a meal and became a theatre of desire, where power was measured in who belonged to whom, even for an hour. Elagabalus carried decadence to notorious extremes. Ancient sources claim he delighted in surrounding himself with companions of every background, blurring gender roles and social boundaries alike. Banquets under his rule were rumoured to include not only music and dance, but orchestrated spectacles of eroticism, designed less to entertain guests than to shock and unsettle them. Whether every story is true or coloured by hostile historians, the association between his reign and unrestrained indulgence endured. The atmosphere encouraged transgression. Wine loosened inhibitions, music softened edges, and lamplight threw shadows that disguised more than they revealed. Guests could find themselves swept into intrigues, their reputations put at risk by a single night of reckless passion. To be noticed by the emperor in such contexts was dangerous flattery one moment, scandal the next. But these indulgences were not always about pleasure. They were about power. When an emperor claimed another man's wife before the entire table, it was a political message as much as an act of lust. To share one's bed with a ruler could mean honour or disgrace, depending on how the story spread afterward. The erotic excesses of the banquet were part of the same language of dominance that flavoured the food and wine. Rome's ruler could command bodies just as easily as armies. The moralists of Rome recoiled at such tales. Writers like Tacitus and Suetonius preserved stories of depravity as lessons in decline, evidence that luxury and lust corroded the empire from within. Their accounts, whether exaggerated or not, painted the banquet as the breeding ground of corruption, where discipline gave way to decadence. To them, the perfumed rooms and whispered trysts symbolized not vitality but decay. For the average Roman, such stories were scandalous gossip. Few would ever see the inside of an imperial feast, but rumours of emperors drinking pearls or cavorting with courtesans carried through the streets. These tales widened the gulf between ruler and ruled, feeding both fascination and resentment. Sexual indulgence at the imperial banquet was more than titillation. It was theatre, humiliation, and political assertion. Beneath the silken curtains and perfumed garlands, beneath the flickering lamps and whispered laughter, power was exercised in the most intimate of ways. For the emperors of Rome, pleasure was not separate from politics. It was another stage upon which their supremacy played out. In Rome, the feast began long before the first course was served. It began with the invitation. To receive a summons to dine with the emperor was both an honour and a risk, a signal that one had been noticed, and that one's loyalty, behaviour, and even appetite might be judged. For some, a seat at the imperial table promised advancement. For others, it could spell disaster. The guest list was never random. Senators and generals, men who commanded armies or votes, were often invited to remind them of their dependence on imperial favor. Ambassadors from distant kingdoms might find themselves reclining beside Roman aristocrats, their presence a living symbol of Rome's dominance. Poets and philosophers were sometimes included, their wit expected to amuse the table, though a poorly timed remark could end a career or a life. But the invitation did not guarantee ease. Guests often discovered that their position in the room was as telling as the invitation itself. To recline near the emperor was a mark of favor, while being placed far down the couches suggested waning influence. Some discovered, too late, that an invitation was not a gift but a summons, a way to test loyalty, to observe rivalries, or to deliver a calculated insult. The anxiety began with the messenger. Invitations arrived on ivory tablets sealed with wax, often hand-delivered by imperial staff. The very act of receiving one was a public moment, observed by friends and enemies alike. Declining was rarely an option. To do so was to risk appearing disloyal. Attending, however, meant stepping into an environment where every word, every gesture might be remembered. The banquets themselves brought together unlikely combinations. A grizzled general might find himself beside a young poet, each competing in subtle ways for attention. A senator might share a couch with a foreign envoy, forced into polite conversation while silently assessing each other's standing. The emperor orchestrated these juxtapositions deliberately, knowing that proximity could inflame tensions or forge uneasy alliances. Women, too, played roles at these gatherings. Imperial wives, sisters, and daughters appeared at some feasts, their presence both symbolic and strategic. Their conversations and alliances carried weight, and their mere appearance could be used to project dynastic strength. At other times, their absence spoke louder still, signalling disfavor or brewing intrigue within the imperial household. Exclusion was as significant as inclusion. To be left off the list could be interpreted as insult, punishment, or warning. Entire careers collapsed when invitations ceased to arrive. A man who once dined nightly with the emperor might find himself suddenly omitted, his power evaporating with each missed feast. The banquet was not merely a pleasure, it was a measure of survival. For foreign envoys, the experience could be bewildering. They encountered not only strange dishes and unfamiliar customs, but the overwhelming reality of Rome's dominance. To recline at the emperor's table was to acknowledge his supremacy, even in the act of eating. These moments reinforced Rome's reach in ways no battle or treaty could. The politics of the guest list extended beyond the hall. News of who attended, who was honored, and who was snubbed spread quickly through Rome. Writers recorded these details, gossip thrived on them, and senators measured their futures by them. The emperor's table was not simply a place of dining, but a chart of the empire's shifting alliances. To be invited was to be exposed, praised, tested, or destroyed. The couches of the imperial banquet were lined not only with silk and cushions, but with peril. Each guest understood that a night of dining could reshape their fate, for better or worse. In Rome, the guest list was the true menu, and lives were consumed along with the food. No Roman feast was complete without wine. Amphorae of every size lined the walls, their clay stoppers pried open to release scents of Falernian, Caecuban, and Cetinian vintages, names that alone evoked prestige. Servants poured the liquid into great bronze mixing bowls, where it was cut with water or left strong, depending on the emperor's whim. From there, it travelled to silver jugs and into goblets that never stayed empty for long. The drinking was ritualized, yet unpredictable. Cups were raised to the gods, to the emperor, to Rome itself. Guests toasted each other in rounds that carried on deep into the night. For Greeks, this had been the symposium, a gathering of minds as much as bodies. For Rome, under the emperors, it became something more unrestrained, a stage for indulgence, where the line between celebration and collapse blurred. As the night advanced, restraint slipped away. Dignified senators found themselves red-faced and staggering, their togas stained with spilled drink. Poets who began with clever verses slurred their lines until words collapsed into laughter. The sticky floors bore witness to overturned cups and careless spills. Servants worked frantically to refill, clean, and catch those who swayed too far. The wine was not merely a drink but a tool. An emperor who pressed his guests to keep pace revealed their limits. Who could remain upright the longest? Who betrayed secrets after too many toasts? A drunken tongue might reveal disloyalty, insult a rival, or whisper ambitions that should never have left the mind. What began as revelry could end in ruin. Some emperors revelled in the chaos. Caligula was rumoured to force guests into relentless drinking contests, mocking those who faltered. Nero staged musical interludes, punctuated by toasts, demanding applause as much as endurance. The more cups consumed, the more authority he displayed, reminding all present that even their bodies could be commanded to exhaustion. Yet the wine also carried a sacred undertone. Dionysus, or Bacchus as the Romans called him, lingered in every libation. His festivals were known for frenzy and abandon, and the imperial banquet borrowed that spirit. The wild laughter, the collapsing bodies, the ecstatic songs, they were, as much ritual as indulgence, echoes of the god who promised freedom in intoxication. But intoxication carried dangers. A senator who let slip a criticism in his stupor might find himself condemned by morning. A general who boasted too freely of his victories could awaken to discover he had earned imperial suspicion. The banquet was both trap and temptation, with wine serving as the emperor's ally in exposing weakness. The city beyond the palace walls knew these tales well. Rumours spread of emperors who drank pearls dissolved in vinegar, of guests who collapsed mid-toast, of endless nights where amphorae were emptied and judgment was drowned. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories reinforced the sense that imperial feasts were places where restraint had no place, and where excess was a weapon disguised as a pleasure. To drink at the emperor's table was to risk both body and reputation. The goblet in one's hand held not just wine, but the possibility of disgrace. In those shadowed halls, intoxication was never simply merriment. It was a test, a revelation, and sometimes a downfall. The imperial banquet hall was designed to overwhelm. Step through its bronze doors, and the outside world disappeared. High ceilings arched above, in patterns of painted stars or gilded coffers, catching the glow of torchlight. Walls shimmered with frescoes, mythic hunts, gods in chariots, oceans filled with dolphins and nymphs, so vivid they seemed to move as the flames danced. Marble floors stretched wide beneath couches draped in silks, polished until they reflected the flicker of lamps. The room itself was a performance, a carefully staged theatre where guests entered not as equals but as witnesses to majesty. Every detail announced imperial wealth. Silver candelabra rose like trees, their branches tipped with flames. Ivory tables supported platters of bronze, silver, and occasionally even solid gold. Incense spiraled upward from censers, blending with the aromas of roasted meats and fresh herbs. The soundscape was as deliberate as the decor. Musicians played lyres and flutes in corners, weaving melodies that echoed against the vaulted ceilings. The clink of dishes, the murmur of servants, the rising and falling of conversation, these formed a rhythm as orchestrated as the music itself. At moments, silence fell suddenly, broken only by the emperor's voice, reminding everyone whose presence dictated the pace of the night. Seating itself was part of the atmosphere. Guests reclined on couches arranged in a U-shape, the triclinium focused toward the emperor. This layout ensured that every eye turned inward, converging on the figure at the head of the feast. Even architecture reinforced hierarchy. No matter how rich or powerful the guest, all faced one man. Light played a central role. Lamps suspended from chains cast golden halos, while braziers filled the air with warmth and smoke. Shadows leapt across frescoed walls, turning painted gods into silent spectators. In such light, jewels sparkled more brilliantly, goblets gleamed more seductively, and the emperor's every movement seemed touched by divinity. For those attending, the hall inspired both awe and unease. Its grandeur was undeniable, but it was also suffocating. To sit amid such splendor meant constant awareness of one's place. Every cough, every stumble, every dropped goblet seemed amplified beneath those painted ceilings. The very walls seemed to conspire, reminding guests that they were being watched not only by peers but by gods painted above them. The atmosphere was therefore more than decoration, it was strategy. The hall's magnificence created distance, ensuring no guest forgot whose house they were in. A senator accustomed to his own marble villa might still feel dwarfed by ceilings higher, pillars broader, and gold brighter than anything he could claim. The banquet hall itself spoke of domination, yet beneath the formality, a kind of electric anticipation lingered. Conversations drifted toward rumour, eyes darted to servants carrying mysterious dishes, and ears strained for the first note of music announcing entertainment. The air carried tension, delight mixed with dread, indulgence with caution. To step into that hall was to enter a world apart, one of perfume, light, music, and surveillance. Every sense was assaulted, every nerve tested. The banquet hall was no mere dining room. It was a stage, and every guest who crossed its threshold became part of the performance. Food and wine were only the beginning. To keep an audience of senators, generals, poets, and foreign envoys engaged for hours, an emperor needed more than delicacies. He needed spectacle in motion. Imperial banquets were not merely meals but theatres, where each course could be followed by a performance meant to dazzle, unsettle, or overwhelm. Musicians filled the air with sound, but these were no ordinary entertainers. Flutes and lyres were accompanied by the water organ, a marvel of Roman engineering that hissed and sang with pressurized air and water. Trumpets announced new acts, their brassy calls echoing off the frescoed ceilings. Songs ranged from solemn hymns to playful drinking verses, each chosen to suit the mood of the evening. Theatrical pieces were sometimes staged right inside the hall. A scene from a Greek tragedy might unfold while guests reclined, the actors' painted masks flickering in lamplight. At other times, comedies brought laughter, though one laughed cautiously when the emperor was present, lest silence mark one as disapproving. Nero himself is said to have performed at such banquets, singing or acting while courtiers offered thunderous applause, whether out of admiration or fear. Dance added another dimension. Hired performers swirled in brightly dyed silks, their bodies bending in feats of flexibility that astonished onlookers. Some dances carried erotic undertones, others mimicked battles or myths. Jugglers and acrobats balanced on poles or tumbled across the marble floors, their daring heightening the sense that anything might happen within those walls. The boundary between entertainment and danger blurred often. On occasion, gladiators sparred briefly in front of the couches, their blades glinting in torchlight. Wild animals, brought from distant provinces, were paraded before the guests. Leopards on chains, bears muzzled but restless, elephants adorned in gold. These creatures were both entertainment and reminders of Rome's dominion over the world. Mechanical wonders also found their place. Ancient writers describe banquet rooms fitted with hidden devices, ceilings that sprinkled rose petals, pipes that released bursts of perfume, even panels that shifted to reveal entire new decorations. Some feasts allegedly featured miniature naval battles staged in pools within the palace, the guests reclining above as tiny ships clashed below. For the guests, entertainment was not optional. To fail to applaud, to appear bored, or to whisper at the wrong moment could draw the emperor's attention in dangerous ways. Praise came loudly, often exaggerated, as guests tried to outdo one another in visible enthusiasm. What seemed like leisure was, in truth, another test. Still, there must have been moments when even hardened senators marvelled. The sudden burst of song, the flash of acrobatics, the roar of a caged beast all stirred emotions no less than the wine. The The senses were constantly engaged: sight, sound, smell, even the vibrations of drums underfoot. A Roman banquet sought to overwhelm until nothing outside the hall seemed real. Performances at these feasts were not sideshows but integral to the experience. They revealed the empire's wealth, its control over artists and animals alike, its mastery of both craft and cruelty. Every performance reinforced the same truth: the emperor could summon beauty, danger, and wonder with a gesture. For the guests, applause was not only appreciation, it was survival. The imperial banquet was never just about indulgence. Beneath the silks and silver, the feasts were battlegrounds without swords, arenas where words, gestures, and glances carried more weight than armies. Every invitation, every couch assignment, every toast was part of a carefully crafted game of influence. For emperors, the guest list was a political map. Allies were placed close at hand, rivals at the fringes, and those under suspicion seated where their discomfort would be most visible. A senator ignored for several nights might recognize the warning. Another, suddenly placed near the emperor, might read it as a test. The seating arrangements were silent proclamations of who stood in favor and who tottered on the edge of ruin. Generosity was also a weapon. Platters heaped with delicacies, gifts slipped discreetly into hands, even the emperor's personal attention. These could bind a man to loyalty more effectively than threats. To refuse a dish offered by the emperor could be taken as an insult. To accept too eagerly risked appearing greedy. In such subtle acts, fortunes turned. Public humiliation was equally potent. Caligula, according to scandalous accounts, delighted in toying with senators by inviting their wives or mocking their weaknesses before the table. Domitian's infamous black banquets, where guests dined in rooms painted entirely dark and served dishes shaped like funeral offerings, unsettled even Rome's most hardened elites. A meal could become an omen, a night of dread disguised as hospitality. Rumors were seeded as deliberately as food. An emperor might hint at campaigns, appointments, or punishments, knowing the whispers would spread from couch to couch and beyond the palace walls. To be the first to hear or the last was itself a measure of standing. A careless comment from a drunken guest could be twisted into evidence of treachery by morning. Even the choice of entertainment could carry political weight. A tragedy about a fallen king might serve as a pointed reminder to restless senators. A comedy mocking foreign pretensions could humiliate envoys. Guests learned to search for meaning in every performance, reading messages between verses and applause. Not all emperors wielded the banquet as a weapon of cruelty. Augustus, careful in his image, preferred moderation, offering feasts that projected stability rather than extravagance. His meals signaled continuity with Roman tradition, contrasting sharply with later rulers who embraced excess as a statement of divine untouchability. The style of a banquet was thus a mirror of the reign itself. For those in attendance, survival demanded constant awareness. To speak at the wrong time, to laugh too loudly or too little, to appear too sober or too drunk, any of these could shift perception fatally. A banquet could elevate a general into a confidant, or it could mark him for removal. Power changed hands as swiftly as cups of wine. In the end, Rome's great feasts were political chessboards disguised as celebrations. The dishes, the music, the wine, even the seating were pieces in a larger game. And the emperor, reclining at the center, played all sides at once, using pleasure and fear with equal precision. For those who dined at his table, every bite carried the taste of danger. To recline at the emperor's table was to enter a place of unease disguised in splendor. The banquet promised delicacies, music, and laughter, but beneath the surface, it was shadowed by danger. Guests never knew whether they would leave with honor, disgrace, or not at all. Poison was the fear that haunted every cup. The tale of Emperor Claudius, allegedly poisoned by a dish of mushrooms at his own table, lingered in memory. Guests eyed their food cautiously, knowing a single bite could seal their fate. Even if the emperor himself offered a morsel, the gesture could be double-edged, an honor or a death sentence. Arrests were another threat. Messengers stood ready outside the hall, waiting for a nod from the emperor. A guest might be summoned to step beyond the couches, only to vanish into the night under guard. The laughter of the feast could turn instantly hollow as one man was led away. The very setting that promised inclusion could become a trap. Symbolism heightened the dread. Domitian's black banquets, where everything from decor to food was cast in funereal tones, unsettled guests into believing their own deaths were imminent. A meal shaped like a coffin, a dish carved into a skull. These were not amusements, but veiled threats, reminders of how easily life could end. Spies added to the sense of suffocation. Servants carrying platters were not always silent. They listened, reported, and spread tales. Words spoken in jest could resurface in reports to imperial ears. Guests learned to measure every phrase, knowing their conversations were not private but performances under constant surveillance. Even the structure of the feast amplified risk. Endless rounds of wine loosened tongues, while calculated seating placed rivals side by side, encouraging slips of temper. A poorly chosen word, a laugh at the wrong time, or a refusal to applaud the emperor's jest could brand a man disloyal. The banquet was not only a test of appetite, but of discipline. For some, simply attending was torment. Anxiety churned with every course, each new dish greeted with as much suspicion as curiosity. The most splendid banquets, filled with golden platters and exotic creatures, were also the most dangerous, for their luxury masked the sharpest edges of imperial power. Yet no one could refuse an invitation. To decline was to court suspicion, to admit fear, to risk exile or worse. Thus men reclined, outwardly smiling while inwardly calculating survival. They lifted goblets with trembling hands, forced laughter through clenched teeth, and prayed silently that the night would pass without their names being called. The dangers of Rome's banquets lay not in the food or the music, but in the emperor who presided. His whims were law, his gestures omens. To sit at his table was to be both honored and imperiled. In such halls, death and favor were served side by side, and no guest could ever be certain which portion was theirs. Though remembered for indulgence, Rome's banquets were also steeped in ritual. The act of reclining to dine was more than comfort. It echoed centuries of tradition that tied food and drink to the gods. Even in the most extravagant halls, religion threaded through the courses, reminding guests that a feast was not only a display of wealth, but a dialogue with the divine. Every banquet began with libations. A portion of wine was poured onto the floor or into a small dish as an offering, most often to Jupiter or Bacchus. Guests raised their cups, invoking blessings before drinking themselves. These gestures, repeated night after night, bound the pleasures of the table to Rome's pantheon. The household gods Lares and Penates were never far from memory. In private homes, their shrines received portions of bread or meat. At imperial feasts, grander symbols stood in their place, statues of deities presiding over the room, or images woven into tapestries and mosaics. The presence of the gods reminded all that abundance came from divine favor mediated through the emperor. Certain dishes carried ritual weight. Eggs opened a meal, symbolizing beginnings. Apples or pomegranates might close it, evoking fertility and renewal. Honey was associated with purity, and the first taste of it could be offered to the gods before guests indulged. Even indulgence followed a sacred script. Foreign cults also left their imprint. The worship of Isis from Egypt and Mithras from the East introduced new rituals and imagery. Some feasts incorporated processions or symbols from these traditions, blending them into Rome's own customs. To dine in the imperial hall could mean encountering a patchwork of deities and rites, each reinforcing Rome's claim to universal dominion. Omens played their part as well. a dish arriving late, a lamp sputtering out, a guest sneezing at the wrong moment, any could be read as a sign. Priests or soothsayers sometimes stood nearby, interpreting events as the night unfolded. In this way, the banquet was as much a theatre of fate as of food. For emperors, the religious undertones strengthened their image. By presiding over rituals, offering sacrifices, or dedicating feasts to particular gods, they blurred the line between host and high priest. The emperor was not simply feeding his people, he was mediating between Rome and the divine. This sacred framing gave even the wildest banquets a sense of legitimacy. Indulgence could be excused as celebration of divine bounty. Drunkenness could be interpreted as Bacchic ecstasy. What might seem corruption to moralists could be reframed as worship when wrapped in ritual language. Guests felt the weight of this atmosphere. Every toast, every dish, every blessing carried religious undertones. To eat was to participate in Rome's sacred order, and to decline was unthinkable. Banquets became not only social and political events, but acts of communal worship, affirming that Rome's gods and its emperor sat at the head of the table. Servants, slaves, and the machinery of the feast. If emperors shone brightest at the banquet, it was only because countless hands worked unseen to hold up the glow. Behind every platter of exotic fish or amphora of prized wine stood armies of cooks, cupbearers, cleaners, and attendants whose labour stitched the evening together. For them, the banquet was not a pleasure, but an ordeal. In the kitchens, heat roared from clay ovens and braziers. Cooks sweated as they turned, spits heavy with boar or stuffed dormice with herbs. Sauces had to be whisked to exact consistencies. Fish sauces measured drop by drop, pastries glazed just before serving. Timing was everything. One mistimed dish could bring a storm of imperial wrath. Cupbearers hovered constantly at the couches, tasked with keeping goblets full but not spilling a drop. Some bore the more terrifying duty of tasting wine before serving it, ensuring no poison reached imperial lips. Their lives were risked in every sip. Others poured endlessly, their wrists aching as they refilled cup after cup until dawn. Musicians, dancers, and actors belonged to this same category of service. Though they might dazzle guests, they were still property, expected to perform without faltering. A cracked note, a stumble in dance, even a poorly timed pause could earn beatings or disgrace. The beauty of the entertainment hid the fear that sustained it. Cleaners scurried quietly, gathering bones, sweeping up petals, mopping spilled wine before it stained marble floors. Their invisibility was their safety. To be noticed was often to be scolded. Guards, too, moved silently, stationed at doors or shadows, their presence a reminder that even in celebration, control was absolute. The sheer scale of labour was immense. An imperial feast could require hundreds of slaves, each assigned a precise role. Some stood waiting with towels and basins of water, so guests could wash their hands between courses. Others fanned braziers to keep air moving. A few, chosen for beauty or wit, were allowed to converse with guests, though always under watchful eyes. Punishment for mistakes was swift. A dropped dish, a spilled cup, or a delayed service could provoke humiliation or violence. Some emperors were notorious for cruelty, using banquets as excuses to discipline servants publicly. Yet at the same time, a well-executed performance could earn small favours. A kind word, a scrap of food from the table, or simply survival. For the slaves themselves, banquets were contradictions. They offered glimpses of splendour dishes most Romans would never taste. Music from the farthest corners of the empire, jewels glittering in torchlight. Yet this splendour was never theirs to enjoy. They lived it only as labour, their exhaustion hidden beneath the glow of the feast. The grandeur of Rome's banquets rested upon this invisible foundation. Guests reclined on couches, praising the emperor's generosity. But it was the silent armies of slaves and servants who ensured the illusion never cracked. Every bite, every song, every flickering lamp bore the fingerprints of lives spent in service. Without them, the emperor's feasts would have collapsed into chaos. To recline at the emperor's table was to taste the empire itself. Each platter carried not just food but geography, drawing a line from distant provinces to Rome's heart. The banquet was less a meal than a map one traced in flavors, textures, and scents gathered from the farthest edges of conquest. Olives from Hispania, oysters from Britannia, and honey from Sicily arrived in jars and baskets after long voyages. Egyptian wheat fed the bread, while African game lions, ostriches, leopards sometimes appeared as dishes or living spectacles. The logistics alone required caravans, fleets, and an army of merchants, sailors, and slaves to keep delicacies flowing into Rome's kitchens. Spices told their own story of reach. Pepper travelled from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, frankincense and myrrh from Arabia. These small jars of powder or resin cost fortunes, and their presence at a feast declared Rome's command over trade routes that stretched beyond sight of its borders. To sprinkle pepper on a dish was not only to season food, but to show mastery of oceans and deserts. Fruit added seasonal marvels. Cherries, carried to Rome from the Black Sea, were symbols of novelty. Pomegranates and dates arrived from the east, while peaches came from Persia. Some emperors built special greenhouses, heated with warm water channels, to grow cucumbers or melons year-round, making the impossible appear at will. Animals provided a different kind of abundance. Fish ponds bred mullets and lampreys, pheasants and peacocks were fattened for display, elephants were paraded through banquets to emphasize dominion. Even when not eaten, exotic creatures stood as living emblems of Rome's global net. The infrastructure behind such abundance was staggering. Roads and aqueducts, ports and warehouses all kept the current of goods steady. Without Rome's engineered arteries, the feasts would have faltered. Every dish confirmed the empire's capacity to organize, conquer, and transport on a colossal scale. To the guest, each bite was layered with meaning. A fig was not merely a fig, it was the product of conquest, a reminder of provinces subdued. A sip of wine carried the vineyards of Gaul or Greece into the cup. The banquet condensed the empire into edible form, allowing those present to consume Rome's reach in a single night. The feast was made tangible, its borders reduced to flavors. For the emperor, this was a declaration more powerful than speeches or monuments. He could summon Africa, Asia, and Europe to his table, and offer them to his guests, proving that the world itself bent to his appetite. The great banquets of Rome did not vanish in a single night, but withered slowly, their splendor eroded by changing times. What had once been the centerpiece of imperial life became a fading echo, remembered more in stories than in practice. Economic strain gnawed first. The empire's vast trade routes faltered under pressure of wars and unrest. Spices from India grew scarce, shipments of grain from Egypt disrupted, game animals harder to source. The flow of abundance that fed the emperor's tables began to sputter. What had been an effortless display became a costly burden. Moral tides shifted as well. Christianity, rising from the fringes to the center of power, cast a critical eye on feasting. Drunken revels and lavish displays clashed with ideals of modesty and piety. As emperors converted, the language of banquets changed less about divine indulgence, more about restraint. Rituals once dedicated to Bacchus or Jupiter lost meaning in a world where bishops now guided faith. The empire's political turmoil added to the decline. Civil wars, invasions, and assassinations left emperors with less time and fewer resources to stage grand spectacles. A ruler besieged by enemies could hardly afford weeks of endless dining. Banquets became smaller, more guarded, their tone shifting from celebration to survival. Even architecture reflected the change. The vast dining halls that once rang with laughter and song grew cold. Marble couches sat empty, kitchens silent. In some cases, the spaces themselves were repurposed into fortifications or abandoned altogether. The empire's palaces carried the ghost of feasts long past. Writers of the later empire looked back on the golden age of banquets with both awe and criticism. Some mourned the loss of grandeur, others condemned the extravagance as the very symbol of Rome's decline. Either way, the feast had become a memory, not a reality. For the people who lived through the transition, the difference was stark. A guest invited to dine in the 4th century found fewer courses, less music, and an air of caution. Gone were the exotic beasts and endless wines. In their place, modest meals framed by political necessity and Christian morality. The banquet, once Rome's ultimate emblem of wealth and control, faded with the empire itself. What remained was legend stories of emperors who drowned guests in rose petals, who feasted on flamingo tongues, who used the table as a throne of power. Reality gave way to memory, and memory hardened into myth. Though Rome's banquet halls eventually fell silent, the idea of them refused to fade. Stories of emperors dining on gilded couches, of musicians playing while ostriches roasted, of wine flowing like rivers, lived on in chronicles and legends. The Roman feast became less an event than a symbol, carried forward through the centuries as shorthand for excess and power intertwined. In the Middle Ages, kings and nobles echoed fragments of Rome's tradition. Great halls filled with long tables, minstrels sang between courses, and elaborate dishes, peacocks served with feathers reattached, pies releasing live birds were crafted to astonish. These spectacles were smaller than Rome's, but drew inspiration from its memory. The Renaissance revived the fascination more deliberately. Humanists, reading ancient texts, marveled at the feasts of Lucullus or Nero. Princes and popes sought to imitate that grandeur, commissioning banquets where art, architecture, and cuisine merged. A Roman model lingered behind every elaborate table setting, every theatrical course. Even today, echoes remain. Modern luxury dining, multi-course meals with rare wines, tasting menus that stretch for hours, owes something to the Roman tradition of food as both nourishment and performance. The language of feast and banquet still carries a Roman weight, hinting at abundance beyond measure. Yet Rome's banquets endure not only in imitation but in cautionary tales. Writers across centuries have used them as symbols of decadence, of the dangers of indulgence unchecked. Nero's flaming feasts, Heliogabalus's showers of roses, Caligula's cruel games. These stories are retold as warnings, as much as marvels. In this way, the Roman banquet became timeless. No longer just meals, they turned into cultural metaphors, reminders of the heights of human indulgence and the edges of human folly. Whether admired, imitated, or condemned, they continue to live in imagination. The halls are gone, the couches empty, the goblets shattered, yet the shadow of Rome's feasts stretches long across history, proof that even meals can shape memory, power, and myth. And so, our journey through Rome's banquet halls comes to an end. We walked beneath glittering chandeliers of oil lamps, reclined on couches beside emperors, and watched as the line between celebration and madness blurred. These were not just dinners, they were performances of power, statements of wealth, and sometimes preludes to betrayal and death. From the humble feasts of the Republic to the excesses of Caligula and Nero, Rome's parties revealed more than appetites. They showed us how emperors ruled not only with armies and laws, but with bread, wine, and spectacle. To feast with the emperor was to step into a world where every bite, every laugh, and every toast carried meaning. Yet, as history reminds us, these wild indulgences came at a cost. Rome's greatest thinkers condemned them as signs of decay, and centuries later, they still serve as warnings of what happens when power loses its balance. The echoes of those banquets live on in our art, our literature, and even in the way we imagine luxury today. So, the next time you sit at a long table, hear music in the background, and raise a glass with friends, remember, you are partaking in a tradition as old as the empire itself. Just be glad your host isn't Caligula. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the wildest parties history has ever known. If you enjoyed this journey into the world of Roman emperors, be sure to stay tuned. We have many more tales of history's most fascinating, bizarre, and unforgettable moments still to uncover. Until then, veil farewell in the language of Rome.